Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Mr. Anselmi here again, talking to you today about the classical empires. We got a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. But today we're going to be covering Persia, Greece, and Rome. And we're going to do it as quickly as we can. We're going to start with Persia. Now, when we say Persia, this map will clear up here in a second. When we say Persia, we typically mean a region in and around modern-day Iran. However, at its height, the Persian Empire took all of this space right here, right? You can see they're on Africa. They're well into Greece and Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, and they are all through the Middle East and well into Asia. The Persian people had a series of dynasties, and the empire itself was begun by the Achaemenid Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty. They're going to be followed up by the Macedonian Empire, who is actually not Persian at all, but rather Greek, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. And then that's going to be followed up by the Seleucid Empire, who are also Greek. And then they're going to be the Parthians, which is really the return of making Persia Persia again. And Persia is going to be for us a hallmark, this idea of the Achaemenid Empire, a theme of history, which is that when something great happens in a region, for the rest of time, that group of people is going to try to identify as that again, right? So the Parthians are going to call themselves Persian. The people who come after will call them the Safavids. Much later, will call themselves Persian and re-identify with Persia. If you meet someone from modern day Iran, today, there's a pretty good chance that they will introduce themselves as Persian. And this idea of hearkening back to the old, you're going to see time and time again. People are going to do it with Rome, right? Everyone's going to want to be Rome. The United States of America has wanted to be Rome. Nazi Germany wanted to be Rome, right? It's going to happen in China, where people want to be the Han Dynasty kind of over and over and over again. We like to do that. We hearken back, and Persia is no different. So, things to know about Persia. Big political dynasties, lots of land. Persia was, at its time, at its height, the largest land-based empire in the history of the ancient world. Now, we're going to get into kind of how they fall to the Greeks through the first and second invasion of Greece, and then the eventual Alexander the Great invasion of Persia, which is actually what this map is showing. But these dynasties, they were supported by bureaucracy in some form, and that's a word that you're gonna want to know, right? Bureaucracy is mid-level management of a government. The Persian Empire is not deeply bureaucratic, but they are going to make use of satraps, right? Provisional governors. And they're going to have some level of autonomy. We're going to hear a lot about bureaucracy, especially as we move into China and other places. So let's tell this story of how Persia grows, expands, and eventually dies. And really, we're going to focus on that last part, right? Persia had grown through conquering and through Cyrus the Great and the people who came before him, right? And he's going to be followed up by people who want to further expand Persia. Darius the First. Darius the First has to deal with a group of people right here, right, in the Ionian region of Greece, who are Persian, right, because they've been conquered by Persia, but they identify as Greek. Now that's tricky because the Greeks were not a unified country at this point in time. In fact, the concept of country is actually a relatively new thing. But Greeks were very interesting in that they had city-states, or polis in Greek, right? And some of these you've heard of, some of you haven't probably heard of, right? Sparta and Athens, chances are you've heard of them, but Thrace, Thessaly, Macedonia, some of these other places you might not have, right? And what a city-state is a polis is a city that identifies first as that city and then as Greek, right? A city-state is autonomous entirely. These are battling kingdoms in a way. The differences between one city-state and another could be as different as two modern countries today, right? Sparta was led by two kings and a group of advisors called the ephors and an assembly of elected officials, literally translated in Greek as the old men, the gerousia. Whereas Athens was a democracy, about as pure as we've ever gotten. Now, they did have kingship, and there's more to it. I'm not going to get into it right now. But if you were a land-owning man, sorry, poor people and women and slaves, but if you were a land-owning man, you got to vote on all the stuff, everything. You were a voter, and you had to vote on all things. So Persia decides with Darius I to invade Greece. Now, it all starts with the Ionian Revolt, but Persia's like, well, we came all this way. We might as well just take what else we can. And they're going to move through Greece right here, right? And they're going to be turned back at Marathon about here under Darius I. That Battle of Marathon in the year 490 is extremely important. Not to AP, but just in history, right? The Greeks stopped the Persian invasion, and in celebration to spread the news, a man, Phidippides, allegedly, legendarily, actually runs 26 miles to Athens and tells everyone that the Greeks have won, and then promptly falls dead. And yes, this is where we get the concept of a modern day marathon. And you might be thinking in your head, Mr. Anselmi, a marathon is actually 26.2 miles, and you're right, but not because of the Greeks. A marathon is 26.2 miles because London hosted the Olympics in 1908, and Queen Alexandra wanted to be able to watch the start of the marathon race from her window at Windsor Castle. Because when you're a monarch, you can, make marathons longer, and, now they're 26.2 miles. So, yeah. But yes, it's that marathon. He's followed up, Darius I is followed up by his son, Xerxes. And if you've seen the movie 300, at this point, 300 is actually kind of old, which is crazy because this used to be a very modern reference, and I used to be a very hip teacher. But this is Xerxes, right? Xerxes I, he actually leads Persia in the second invasion of Greece. He's the son of Darius, and he leads Persia in the second invasion of Greece, except he probably didn't look like this because Hollywood is weird. This is actually probably what he looked like. Or at least what we guess. And Xerxes I is going to lead Persia on a second invasion of Greece in 480 to 479 BC or BCE. And they're going to make it all the way to Thermopylae, where they're going to be stopped by this fellow. Well, not that guy. That's Xerxes. This guy right here, Leonidas, and 300 Spartans. Those 300 Spartans are accompanied by other soldiers, but it's the story of the 300 Spartans against an army of 10,000 or more that has stood the test of time. Now, actually, the Greeks lose the Battle of Thermopylae, but they fight. This army of 300, 1,300, fight a group of Persians of 10,000 to 20,000 to maybe even 100,000. And they fight them for 7 days. They hold them off for 7 days, which actually gives the rest of Greece enough time to catch up, right? Following that moral defeat, very soon after, Persia suffers an actual literal defeat at the Battle of Salamis. And from there on, right, it's a super cool battle. Go read about it. But the Battle of Salamis is a naval battle, and Xerxes goes home ashamed for the rest of his life. Greece doesn't forget this invasion. And that's actually kind of another theme of history. People have really long memories. And so 100 years later, right, Alexander the Great, that's Rome, don't worry about it. Alexander the Great, right, he decides that he is going to combat the Persian ideas that had occurred 100 years before. He's going to get back at Persia 100 years later, and he's going to go on a killing tour of Persia, right? Just a little note, one of the other big developments out of Athens, aside from democracy, is philosophy. And really modern Western philosophical thought traces its roots back to Greece. And it's going to start with Socrates, right? The Socratic, the gadfly. He annoyed everyone until they asked him to kill himself. Moving on to Plato, kind of not Plato. He's going to develop the first academy, which is really one of the first concepts of college or higher education. He's going to tutor my boy Aristotle, right? Who is, I mean, he wrote on everything: physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, aesthetics, poetry, theater, music, rhetoric, politics, logic, and obviously ethics, of course. That's actually where he gets his mainstay. And he's wrong about a lot of things, right? But a lot of things he's actually very, very good on. And Aristotle is the personal tutor of Alexander the Great. So when you have a good teacher, you can conquer the entire known world. So Persia, this is actually a map of Alexander the Great's conquering. He begins his tour in 334, and makes a quick trip over to Egypt, conquers all that, and then conquers all of this. He will be named the Shah of Shah, or King of Kings, in Persia in the year 336, even though he'll continue conquering for more or less the rest of his life. Alexander the Great, he did all this, by the way, he started when he was 22. He dies 10 years later at 32, still kind of in the field. And this is one of the most rapid expansions we've ever seen of a general. But Alexander the Great conquers all this land, and here's another theme of history. When you conquer a bunch of stuff and you don't have a proper successor, there will always be a fight for who gets control after you're gone, right? Alexander the Great dies in 323. This empire is no longer Macedonian, Macedonia being the region, the polis that Alexander the Great was from himself. Even 10 years after Alexander is gone, right? Or barely 10 years after Alexander is gone. He dies in 323. By 312, this massive empire, which all belonged to Macedonia, gets broken up and divided among Alexander's generals, right? Seleucus getting the Persian Empire, Ptolemy getting the Egyptian, and we won't really worry about the others. Now, that brings us on to Rome. Okay, Rome is going to eventually conquer all of Greece, so that's why they're good to talk about next. Now, Rome has really three periods of importance: the kingship from 753 BCE or BCE to 509 BCE, the Republic 509 to 27, and then the Empire 27 BCE to 476 AD. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the kingship. Rome has 7 kings, probably more, but we're not going to worry about it. The last being Tarquinius Superbus, and not a great time for Rome. They decide they never want a king again, so they move on to a republic. A republic is a governmental system where citizens vote on representatives and the representatives vote on stuff. That's the difference between it and a democracy. Now, you live, if you're watching this in America, in a democratic republic. And we stole that straight from Rome, right? They're set up with a consul, actually 2 consuls who serve in a role similar to the president. They have legislative bodies, a Senate and an assembly, kind of a higher house and a lower house, just like us, right? They put forward laws, they veto laws. It's where we got a lot of our ideas. And then we're going to move on to the Roman Empire in 27 BCE. Now, 27 BCE is listed as the start date for the Roman Empire, but really, the Roman Empire really kind of begins before that, right? Arguably in 46 BCE. That's when Julius Caesar takes control and becomes dictator for life, 45 BCE. He becomes dictator for life. Now, Julius Caesar is the last in a long line of generals and consuls who overstep their boundaries. And eventually he names himself dictator for life, and Rome agrees. They're fine with it, except for the senators of Rome who end up murdering him on the steps of the Senate in the year 44. Now, the reason we don't call that the beginning of the empire is because Rome descends into a kind of a second civil war, right after that, eventually ending in Augustus Caesar, Octavian Caesar, right? Defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, you might have heard those names before, and establishing the Principate, the empire in Rome. Now, this empire is going to last quite some time. I list it as 476, although there's really an important distinction to make here. In the year 285, the Emperor Diocletian actually divides the Roman Empire, right? Divides it right about here, okay? Right about there. right? And this city, right here, Byzantium, is going to be really, really important. In the year 330, 146 years before Rome is going to fall, this city, which at that point was called Constantinople, will actually serve as the capital for Rome, right? So you've got an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. And when we say Rome falls in 476, we actually don't mean all of Rome. What we mean is the western half, right? This side falls to barbarian invasions, to a number of other reasons. And that's going to lead to the Middle Ages, which is a whole nother video. But what's left is this eastern half. And they continue on. They will call themselves Roman. They will identify as Roman. And they will not fall until 1453 to the Ottoman Empire. But historians make a distinction. When Rome falls, when the western half of Rome falls, we call that the fall of Rome. And even though these guys call themselves Roman, we start calling them something else. This is going to be the Byzantine Empire. Okay? The Byzantine Empire. And that's important, that even though they call themselves Roman, really it's a continuation of Rome, but it's going to change so much over time that looking back, we can't call it Rome anymore. Now, that was quick. That was probably not as quick as you'd like for it to be, but that was about as quick as I could do it. That's some pretty wide brushstrokes on the classical era, from Persia to Greece to Rome. These empires are foundational to understand. When we move into the modern era, there are people trying to be the next Rome, the next Greece, and the next Persia. And without having some understanding of who these groups are, it's really difficult for us to know what they're trying or aspiring to be. I encourage you to go read more about each one of these empires. And these are only 3 of the classical empires. There are more. There's a lot else going on in the world, but these are the things that we've got to talk about. So, with that being said, I look forward to our next video. I hope you and your family are safe. Stay safe and keep perspective.